Hola cariños, ¿qué tal estamos? Y bienvenidos al proyecto de StudyTube Project. No sé cómo decirlo en español. Hoy voy a hacer un video sobre la novela Don Quijote, o mejor dicho, el ingenioso hidalgo Don Quijote de la Mancha. Me encantaría hacer el video entero en español, pero simplemente no tengo tiempo, ya que tengo tanto trabajo y no es posible pasar máquina todo lo que diría en un video de 7-8 minutos. Pero os prometo que cuando termine el semestre haré un video entero en español con subtítulos, por supuesto, para que me podáis entender. Soy consciente de que queréis un video en español y lo haré, pero en 2 meses. Han pasado 2 años, yo creo, desde que filmé un video en español, así que no sé si mi español ha mejorado o no. Yo creo que no, pero voy a hacerlo de todas maneras. But for now, I'm going to switch back into English because I, quite frankly, wish I had time to translate an entire video into Spanish, but I just don't. But today's video is going to be about Don Quixote. Don Quixote just sounds so funny in English. But it is basically the novel, it's like the watershed novel that was like responsible for what we now define as the modern novel, aka the books that you read today are in a great way influenced by this specific book. Okay, so this book, which I've already said is basically got a really long title or whatever, but everyone just knows it as Don Quixote. I did briefly talk about it in my Golden Age video. Do go and watch my Golden Age video before you watch this video because it will make a lot more sense if you watch that one first. But this book is dripping in innovation. Cervantes is the king of nuance. Cervantes is the author, by the way. He's the king of nuance. Anything he says, you just have to take with a pinch of salt because everything he says somewhere, he undermines somewhere else. He's very good at multi-layered, very complex things. So I'm obviously not going to be able to talk about everything about Don Quixote in this video, but I'm going to try and talk about some of the things that I like the most about the book because I really do like it, even though it's very long. So, as I mentioned in my Golden Age video, his main aim, like the place that he aims fire at is chivalric novels. And I've already explained what chivalric novels are essentially, but they were just super like romance-filled, fantastical exploits of knights going and saving the planet and being generally amazing and chivalric and having all these codes of honour and getting the girl. You know, just watch Shrek, right? What Prince Charming thinks he's gonna do, that's basically a chivalric novel, right?
Sought the help of a fairy godmother who had them lock the young princess away in a tower, there to await the kiss of the handsome Prince Charming. It was he who would chance the perilous journey through blistering cold and scorching desert, traveling for many days and nights, risking life and limb to reach the Dragon's Keep.
So this novel is basically about a guy who reads so many chivalric novels that his head gets filled with all of these fantasies and he starts to mistake what he reads in those novels for reality. So one day he wakes up, fashions himself as the knight Don Quixote, gets a sidekick called Sancho Panza who's just like a local peasant, and goes off gallivanting around Spain doing all of these what he thinks are, you know, like fights and, you know, like amazing chivalric deeds and basically trying to live out his chivalric fantasies in contemporary Spain. So he's basically insane, essentially. Reading all of these books has made him insane, and all of his mates, like the priest and like all of the local people are being like, hey mate, we're not really vibing with what you're doing here, not gonna lie, you look a bit crazy. They try and bring him back multiple times, but he wants to impress his beautiful lady Dulcinea. Dulcinea is actually just a peasant, so like she's not like this beautiful peerless woman that he thinks is like he's doing all these actions for. So basically the whole novel is about him going around Spain and just sort of being a bit crazy really, and all the people and stuff that he meets along the way. Obviously the book's very long, so I can't go into like every single encounter he has, but I will mention some of them as we go through the video. This sort of like plot setup is exactly how Cervantes is exacting his like main satire in the novel. So he wants to make fun of chivalric novels, right? So by putting the grand feats that you see in chivalric novels into a very like contemporary and real setting, the bathos that's created there, so like the sort of anticlimactic reality of the situation, shows all of these fantasies to be ridiculous and stupid, and that's basically what he's doing. So in order to parody the chivalric novel, he could have just written a chivalric novel himself and sort of like parody it through that way, but because he's so blooming clever, he made like a narrative diegetic world where these chivalric novels exist. So the characters in the book have discussions about chivalric novels, they talk about the nature of chivalric novels, like they do exist, and because the main character has read so many of these novels, he then goes insane and tries to recreate that to very humorous effect. That humorous effect is the main vehicle through which Cervantes is exacting his parody of chivalric novels, if that makes sense. So for example, there's a scene where the priest and a couple of other geezers are burning Don Quixote's library because they're like, we need to get rid of these books, they need to be out of here because he's going insane because he's read them all. And they talk about them, they talk about real books that existed in real 15th, 16th century Spain, and they actually have like a conversation about them. So it's kind of this duality of like the world that the reader knows and this sort of like made up world, which also isn't that much of a made up world because it's set in the Spain that they are literally living in. Sort of juxtaposition between the madness of Don Quixote and the very sort of like banal reality that he's trying to impose this chivalric fantasy on basically exposes the chivalric romances for what they are, which is false, a bit ludicrous, and well, they thought that they didn't really have any intrinsic value, either morally or culturally, because they were just injecting fantasies into people's heads, and that's kind of what the parody shows. An example of this would be, as I mentioned in my last video, I think this is the most famous example. In fact, there's an idiom, which is like to be tilting at windmills, which literally comes from this scene where Don Quixote goes up to these windmills and he thinks that they're giants that he has to slay and like to show his bravery and how amazing of a knight he is, when in reality they are literally just windmills, and his sidekick Sancho is like, hey mate, they're just windmills, don't get it twisted, they're just windmills. And he's like, no, like I must, you know, knock them down and like show myself to be the amazing knight that I am for my beautiful Dulcinea. Sancho's a bit like, okay, go off sis, like do what you like. But then he actually injures himself trying to attack them, and this is like a recurring theme. Like he will like intercept in situations or like attack people, and it always ends up going badly for him most of the time. So it's this just sort of like recurring event of him basically having the mick taken out of him but not realising that he's having the mick taken out of him that's kind of the crux of the novel. But this is why the novel is so clever, and this is why I like the novel, is that it doesn't just completely rip chivalric novels to shreds. This was a rich tradition. It was a rich tradition of novels that had flourished up until the time that, you know, he was writing it. Naturally, they were getting to the tail end of their life, do you know what I mean? So like when they first started, you know, they were alright, and then obviously as more and more people wrote them, they became less and less original and sort of had less and less value, right? So he was writing this when the chivalric romance had kind of had its day, but he's aware that it did have its day at some point, and he is also aware that in parody there is homage, and you know, in mockery there is paying tribute to the tradition in itself. He doesn't see it as a completely negative thing. So for one, Don Quixote's funny, he entertains us, the book is entertaining, right? The novel in itself is enjoyable to read, so that in itself is paying tribute to how these chivalric adventures can be enjoyable. But second of all, and this is where it's going to get a little bit complex, right, because this is where even I get a bit confused and I have to sort of like reference my notes because I get lost. There's actually a lot to be said about the fact that the novel is split into two parts here. So the novel is split into two parts. It was published 10 years apart, right, these two parts. So the first part, you know, is about Don Quixote and like him living his, well, best, I was gonna say his best chivalric life, but like it's not really his best chivalric life, is it? The second part, however, was published 10 years later, and the first part of the novel exists in the world of the second part. So that novel has been published and people in the second part have read it and they've heard about Don Quixote and they know of him and they've laughed at his adventures as we have. So in the novel, the second part of the novel, there is a version of the first part that exists. So the characters in that are reacting to that, and their approach to Don Quixote is different because they've read about him. Does that make sense? So basically, in the second half, there's a duke and a duchess who have read about Don Quixote, think it's hilarious, and then deliberately try and recreate the world of chivalry to play to the fact that they know that he's insane. So it's like, they know that everything that I've just said, they know that he's in his own little world, and they actually like try and like capitalize on that by creating all these chivalric situations, then playing into his mind of what he thinks is real. But the readers in the second part who've read the first part are also entertained. So that is testament to Don Quixote as a character. He is fundamentally entertaining, you know, like we laugh at him, but there's still some value in the fact that when you've read it, you know, you've enjoyed it. And second off, although I've said that he does make a lot of mistakes, granted, he does also have a positive impact. He does bring together like these two lovers that have been split apart, and he also does have quite a positive effect overall on his sidekick and leads to his maturation over time as well. So he does leave a positive footprint in some respects, and you do feel quite sorry for him by the end, because by the end, after the Duke and Duchess have played all these tricks on him, he starts to get dejected, defeated, and he eventually like retreats back home, gives everything up, and like completely just like the illusion just completely crumbles and he just dies, which is actually really sad, and you do feel really bad for him by the end. I was like emotional. So these chivalric values of like wanting to be noble and having good moral intentions are somewhat praised, you know. Obviously they are a bit ludicrous, the novels, and you know, they don't really have much substance, but they do, you know, promote, you know, first and foremost looking out for other people and like wanting to do your best by the world. So Cervantes does actually realise that. So the novel's not just completely taking the piss out of Don Quixote. If anything, in the second part, a lot more of the satire is turned on the people that read the novels, because the Duke and Duchess, who sort of like take the mick out of him and see how far they can push him before he cracks, are actually quite cruel, and you know, they are portrayed as in a quite a cruel light. So you know, the arrow is not pointing just at Don Quixote. Like, I think the arrows are being fired at everyone in this novel. Nobody in this novel is free from the wit of the author. Like, he wants to sort of mock everything and also simultaneously praise everything. He's a very confusing guy. What I basically mean is it's very hard to say with certainty any one intention that the author had, because everywhere that you find evidence to support your claim, you'll find evidence to contradict it. So he does take the piss out of chivalric novels, but he also praises them too. That was like a very sort of simplified overview of it. Obviously, like, the conversation is quite deep, and it goes quite deep into like literary philosophy and like just literary theory in general about what the value of a novel is and what exactly satire is or whatever. But the other thing I did want to talk about, which I have kind of touched upon, is another way in which it is a very modern novel, or paves the way for a modern novel. So it's not only self-reflective in that it's mocking other novels and other literary forms, but it is also conscious. It's self-conscious of the fact that it is a book, that it's a world created of words. The world that exists in the book is not completely separate from reality, as I've mentioned, because of the fact that the novel exists in the second part of the novel, and it is set in a very contemporary setting, and real books, places, etc. are mentioned that are real and in real history, right? But also it messes with your mind, because there's not just one narrator telling this story. It's not like once upon a time there was a man called Don Quixote and then it just tells it, right? There are actually like 5 different layers here, which gets a bit confusing. So bear with me while we try and explain, because I literally have had to write it down on like a little timeline. I get that confused. I think we all do, to be honest. So there's Cervantes, who's the author, right? The guy that wrote the book, okay? He is there in the prologue, and obviously he's there in the whole story because he's literally writing the words on the page, right? So he pops his head in at the prologue. He's like, hi, this book's going to be about taking the mick out of chivalric novels, etc, 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 goodbye. But he's actually not gone, obviously, because he's writing the book. But then you have 2 parts of the novel which are both told by a second author. I've already mentioned the whole 2-part thing, so keep that in your mind. So part 1, chapters 1 to 8, so the first 8 chapters of the first part are told by this second author who's picked them up, but they've actually been written by somebody else. So he's reading out a story that's been written by somebody else, essentially, for the first 8 chapters. So not only have you got the author and then a second geezer, then you've also got the geezer from which the second geezer's picked the book up from, right? And then right in the middle of when he's about to start a fight, it freezes and the second author's like, oh, that's where this part of the story ends. Huh. Right. The rest of the novel is actually found in another source. So this story is like from fragmented sources, essentially. And to make matters even worse, it's a translation. So this like second part of the story was actually written by a Moor, Cide Benete Benengeli or something like that. Is that his name? I don't even know. Yeah, okay, it is. So the second author, who's trying to find the rest of the story, has to employ a Moorish translator who can speak both Spanish and Arabic to translate it from Arabic into Spanish, right? So not only have you got the fact that it's not the second author's story anyway, it's two separate sources, you also have to remember that the second source has been translated by someone who could have left bits out, changed bits, corrupted it. And at the time, obviously, Moors were viewed with a lot of suspicion. If you go and watch my last video, you'll see why. And then you think, oh my gosh, like, did he have dubious intentions? And the reader at the time would have been like, oh, so this is a translation by someone that's not necessarily reliable. So how do we know we're reading the proper story? This is a very clever device, right? Because the author is making sure that the reader can never sit comfortably, right? The reader up until then could generally just sort of like sit nicely into the narration and just accept that the story was being told and could just sort of delve into it and read it, you know, cover to cover, right? But now suddenly you've got the author, you've got the second author, you've got the person who wrote the second manuscript, and you've got the translator, all of which are interjecting here and making sure that we don't know what's true and what's not. We don't know what the actual story is. Add to that the second part literally has the first part in it and you just don't know where to turn, right? This fundamentally redefines the relationship between reader and author in so many ways. The author has distanced himself from the fiction because there are so many different voices that we don't know what is Cervantes, what is the guy, what is what. We don't know. We don't know. It gets very confusing. To be honest, I still don't know. Nobody knows. Our trust in the veracity of what we're reading is constantly undermined, be it through the knowledge in the back of our heads that everything has been filtered and changed through like various people, or through literal interjections at parts where they're commenting on how the story's been translated or how the story's being told. Like, there are literally comments about the fact that it's a story and that it's being told. It's self-conscious that it's almost a book, right? It breaks down this illusion of the sort of literary world existing in its own right, because we are very aware that this has been manipulated by the author to sound a certain way, and certain truths are probably not getting through, if they even existed at all. This very much taps into that sort of Baroque mentality of skepticism which I was talking about in the last video, where because humans are conflating truth and fiction without realising it, what's true and what's not? Is there truth? What is reality? Is everything deceiving? Is everything a dream? Like, who knows, right? What should we believe? Is there anything that we should believe? Is there anything such as truth, right? That is exactly what this novel is tapping into at its core, right? Because nothing can be taken for fact in this novel, and that's personally why I love it. I could go into that so much more detail, but you're essentially jumping through like so many frigging hoops, right? And you're having to rethink and step back and be critical. You're having to be an intelligent, active reader rather than just passively accepting what's being given to you on a plate. And if anything, this is also part of the parody of the chivalric romances which I was talking about earlier, because those novels were absolutely ridiculous, right? They weren't true, but at the start of all of those novels they claimed that they were historically accurate. So at the start of this novel there's also a claim that this is the accurate rendering of the story, whilst also blatantly not being. So in a way it's also parodying that aspect purely by the fact that it's been written in a certain way. Like, it's so clever. There's so many layers. Again, to reference Shrek, donkey, onions, layers, that is the sort of situation we have here. This is what's known as metafiction. It's basically the awareness that the fiction is a fiction in the fiction, right? This could get very complex, and I'm aware that this video is already 20 minutes long. I did not really mean for that to happen, but it just is such a difficult novel to talk about without going into like every single thing. There are so many other things about this novel that I could talk about, but those are two of the main reasons why it's seen as kind of the advent of the modern novel and why it's such an important part of the literary canon of our world, basically. I love it. I would really recommend reading it, even if you read it in English. To be honest, I read it in English the first time because sometimes it's just easier to get the gist of the story. It's very long. But I would really recommend it, actually, and it's a novel that'll make you think. It will make you think, and it definitely encapsulates the spirit of the age, and Cervantes is definitely one of my favourite Spanish authors for that reason. So yeah. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a huge thumbs up. Comment down below any topics you would like me to do, or if you'd like me to do a video about something like a German topic. So I feel like I am showing my favoritism for Spanish here, really, aren't I? But yeah, do let me know, and we'll see you very soon on the wow, I just can't speak any language today, can I? I'll see you very soon. No, we will see you very soon on the StudyTube project for a new video. See you later, guys. Bye.